Psalm 27. The Lord is the light of my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When evildoers assail me to eat up my flesh, my adversaries and foes, it is they who stumble and fall. Though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war arise against me, yet I will be confident. One thing have I asked of the Lord, that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. For he will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will lift me high upon a rock. And now my head shall be lifted up above my enemies all around me, and I will offer in his tent sacrifices with shouts of joy. I will sing and make melody to the Lord. Hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud. Be gracious to me and answer me. You have said, seek my face. My heart says to you, your face, Lord, do I seek. Hide not your face from me. Turn not your servant away in anger. O you who have been my help, cast me not off. Forsake me not, O God of my salvation. For my father and my mother have forsaken me, but the Lord will take me in. Teach me your way, O Lord, and lead me on a level path because of my enemies. Give me not up to the will of my adversaries, for false witnesses have risen against me, and they breathe out violence. I believe that I shall look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord, be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. So starting again at verse 1. The Lord is my light and my salvation. I always find it significant to note adjectives that any part of the Bible uses to describe God, and then what those adjectives imply for the one speaking, which in this case, God being light and salvation. Why would I fear anyone else? I know that I don't know what light necessarily implies, but I know that darkness is often associated with fear, with being lost, or loss itself. And salvation, the opposite of that, would obviously be despair, hopelessness, destruction, or just suffering. And so if God is both light and salvation, what else is there to fear? The Creator God is everything that we have, everything that supports us. And here it's stronghold. The stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? Again. Then this one, it's whom shall I fear? Whom shall I be afraid? Both are whom, be afraid or fear. I think it's basically saying the same thing. When evildoers assailed me to eat up my flesh, my adversaries and foes, it is they who stumble and fall. I think those who find themselves to be on the losing side of any oppressor, to be the vulnerable one, to be the one who doesn't know how to respond, doesn't know what to do differently. Like, I doubt this psalmist is talking about they literally want to eat his flesh, but that idea of they want to consume all of me. They want nothing of me to be left. But here it says, it's they who stumble and fall. Though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. I think that's a beautiful sentiment from, the rise of, or that reminds me of great people like Viktor Frankl, a survivor of the German Nazi concentration camps. who really spoke into the fact that we can only control so much. We can choose more than we realize, though, even in times of desperation. And in this verse 3, the psalmist is saying, yeah, I can control what my heart fears, how my heart responds to the realities that I face, particularly in light of verse 1, where the psalmist, the author, presumably David, is calling out God as that source of safety, of comfort, of salvation. And though they say, or though he says, I will be confident, it is a confidence based in God, always. One thing that I've asked of the Lord that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. I make these highlights around seeking after and dwelling in the house of the Lord because, well, seeking after implies intent. And I think our intentions are what we always have to keep coming back to moment by moment, day after day, because they will constantly be drawn to one thing or another and continuing to refocus, reprioritize, clarify, and even strengthen, build, develop our intention is essential for a healthy faith and spirituality. That I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. You know, in the Bible we have record of Moses having supposedly met, face to face with God in the tabernacle, and it caused, or it had such a physical impact on him that his face shone bright, and says that people were scared of him because of it, and so he wore a veil to cover his face, to hide the glory of God that was reflected in his physical body. And so I'm curious about what David saw, what this beauty that he noticed in the temple. But to inquire, I think, is also an interesting idea. Like, was this prayer? Was this sacrifice? What did his inquiry look like to God? Questions for another good time. That was what I thought. The word that inquire can be associated with can also be meditate. And I think that's very significant. And in terms of a number of Bible dictionaries as well as word studies. Interesting. So the same word in Hebrew that you see right there in the middle, bakar, I think, yeah. In dealing with ancient languages, they can show up differently in different places depending on context or how it's used. The same way we have, the word love that gets used to talk about pizza or our significant other or our kids or a pet. But it can be seek, to inquire, to differentiate, to reflect. And so I think there is good evidence to suggest that this verse that David This verse where David is talking about to inquire in his temple is really talking about meditating, a deep kind of reflective prayer. I think that's what centering prayer offers us. And it is one that I can speak from my own experience to say, like, the more I do it, the more I understand and really, just practice it. There is such comfort that comes from it. There's always like some kind of resistance to it almost. That part of me, whines, complains, like, oh, I could do so much else. Oh, there's so much else that like I want to do, or that would be fun or productive, like all these different parts that just have a different idea of what is really important. And yet I know in my heart of hearts, in my spirit, that I do want the same thing as David, that I want to dwell in the house of the Lord, which, as we know in the New Testament, the house of the Lord is our bodies. And so there's something beyond even the temple that he might have been referring to that Christ and then Paul pick up and discuss or really illuminate in the New Testament, which is our body is the dwelling place of God. It is inside that we really encounter God. And so to not disassociate, as the word or the opposite of dwelling in that place might look like, to really be still and gaze. And I think inquiry is really what is at the core of all of that, is a seeking of who God is in our deepest inner experience. For he will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble, verse 5. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will lift me high upon a rock. And now my head shall be lifted up above my enemies all around me, and I will offer in his tent sacrifices with shouts of joy. Curious if that implies that the sacrifices themselves are the shouts of joy, or if it's literally sacrifices and like alongside with shouts of joy. But I know from the rest of Scripture that God oftentimes calls out the fact that it's not the sacrifices, like the bulls, the goats, the birds, all of the actual animal sacrifices that used to define Judaism and worship of God, worship of Yahweh, worship of the universal creator, that God eventually gets sick of our attempts to control, manipulate, or simply contain God by the way we do with sacrifices, the way Israel did, and ignore the practical calls to justice that fill the books of the prophets in the Old Testament and define the teachings of Christ. And here, none of that matters. He just wants to sing and make melody to the Lord. He just wants to be present. Hear, O Lord, starting at verse 7, when I cry aloud, be gracious to me and answer me. You have said, seek my face. My heart says to you, your face, Lord, do I seek. Is this leb, which is Hebrew for heart? Yep. So leb is really like our deepest heart, our motivation, our drive. It is kind of referring in some ways to our passions, but it is ultimately based in our bodies. It is kind of the embodied drive that we have. And our hearts can be turned towards many things, and it can motivate behaviors towards all of those things. And so in verse 8 here, it's God who says, seek my face, which is also ironic because God's face is the one thing throughout Scripture that aside from Moses, like I was saying, no one is ever really able to see. No one can gaze upon the face of the Lord. And even Moses, outside of those stories of the tabernacle meetings, God is the one who, in the book of Exodus, says that no one can gaze upon his face. And so he hides Moses in the rock and walks by. And same thing happens with Elijah in the book of First Kings, where he's hidden and there's the storm and the earthquake or the wind and the earthquake and I think a fire, and God's not in any of them. But coming back to verse 8 here, it is the face of God that we seek, to be face to face with our Creator. I think that's the big question of religion, of spirituality, is how do we come face to face with love, with our Creator, with God? And then going into verse 9, he petitions him even more. Hide not your face from me. Turn not your servant away in anger. I imagine that in anger it is something to do with justice or sin or unrighteousness. And those of us who really know ourselves know that we are full of reasons to be cast off. We are full of reasons to not be loved. But some part of us believes, hopes, has been told or reassured that the divine does love us, that there is a part of us untouched by all of our sin that is still connected to God. And God is seeking to renew, to restore, to redeem that image in us, that essence of us. Otherwise, for the sake of the argument, how could David say, the Lord is light and salvation and stronghold for his life? God is all these things. And we are both sinner and saint. Here he grieves more practically in verse 10 that his father and mother have forsaken him, but trusts that God will not join them in abandoning him, that God will take him in. Teach me your way, O Lord, and lead me on a level path because of my enemies. Give me not up to the will of my adversaries, for false witnesses have risen against me. And they breathe out violence. There's contrast here in some significant ways to the disposition of David's heart, going back to verse 8, and his adversaries, the false witnesses, those who want to destroy him and even cannibalize him. And they breathe out violence. Such an interesting statement. I think our breath is the foundation and formation of our words. It is our vocal cords that offer shape and organization to the sound of breath moving up from our lungs and out through our mouths. And so in breathing out violence, they must be forming words. They must be speaking violent intent. And as Jesus teaches, like, it is out of the heart that the mouth speaks. So to breathe out violence, my mind goes back to Genesis chapter 5 and 6, where the earth had become corrupt and filled with violence. Like, violence was all that the world knew at that time, as the Bible tells. And God regretted it. God regretted having made creation because violence was all it knew, because corruption was all it became. And there is probably, a truth to be told or recognized in that, in seeking God, in pursuing actual encounter and experience of God, what must be associated with seeking God's face, that there will always be adversaries to that. There will be those who turn against it, who push away, who don't want to see, experience, encounter, or be confronted with a different way of being, with something that challenges their own power, authority, control, comfort, love. And so, like many of us, when we are threatened, we become violent. I mean, it's that, or we run away, but I don't think David would be too concerned about adversaries who are only running away and retreating from him. So let's assume that these are people only activated in their sympathetic nervous system and only activated in terms of fight. Verse 13, I believe that I shall look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. I wonder what he means here. What goodness of the Lord is he referring to? It's obviously something that takes place in our created reality. This isn't something that takes place in our inner world or in some spiritual realm. Like, this isn't theorizing. He really means that he will look upon it. He will be able to witness it, this goodness of God. But this is a belief, and in that regard, it is a hope. But it's one that he can make real throughout his own behaviors, throughout his own relationships, in the ways that he responds to the world. And so in verse 14, all he can do and all he can say is wait for the Lord. Be strong. There will be adversaries, there will be challenges. Have courage, just like Moses told Joshua before he left him. But wait. Wait for the Lord. I think that too is what we do in centering prayer and in meditation. So we wait for God to do what God needs to do in us, to change us, to transform us, to grow us, to let us become truly Christian in the sense of little Christs walking around in a dark world. That as God is our light and salvation, our stronghold of life, we can learn to be that for other people. That, I believe, I hope, is the way that God is taking us. But to learn how to walk that way, we have to wait. We have to learn how to see it. We have to be formed by that presence with God. So be strong, Let your heart take courage and wait for the Lord.